Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor. This is a viewer-supported feature. We depend on your contributions to keep putting out these segments. We depend on your questions. We do not write our own. Every question that we answer has been sent in by a viewer, and they cover economics, political philosophy, culture, whatever's on your mind about public affairs in Canada, broadly conceived.
All right, here's one from Isabel, and she says, which of the current federal government departments would you retain? Which would you dispense with, and how?
Now that is an excellent question, and let me begin with a slight digression. I would get rid of all the parliamentary secretaries, parliamentary assistants, all those things, because these are just ways in which the executive branch incorporates more of the ambitious members of the legislature into the executive, giving them pay and perks, provided that instead of being legislators restraining the executive, they become part of the executive branch, making sure that the legislature is tame and obedient. But what about the departments? Okay. I would get rid of a number of departments entirely on the grounds pragmatically that these are not things that the federal government should be doing, and in many cases constitutionally they're things it's not meant to be doing. For instance, we have a Ministry of Agriculture and Agri-Food. Thomas Jefferson said, were we directed from Washington when to reap and when to sow, we should soon want bread. What is the federal government to do with farming? Now, I'm not going to pretend that I can remember the names of all these things. I looked them up because there's just so many and they're just so ludicrous. For instance, why do we have a Minister of Employment, Workforce and Labor?
To make sure there is one?
The government doesn't create jobs. A Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. I could just see infrastructure, but of communities?
That's
we
to
get
hand out money.
Communities from the government?
Is that the person handing out all the checks? That's
Oh,
probably
right, yes,
one.
the person handing out all the checks. There we go. Well, we certainly need that.
I've explained that one.
Minister of the Status of Women. Again, this is part of the government will dissolve the populace and elect a new one. Since we're all a bunch of misogynist homophobes, we elected them to smarten us up, and they're going to go ahead and do it. It just doesn't make any sense. What else we got here? Oh, Minister of Canadian Heritage. Because you wouldn't have a heritage if the government didn't put out those lovely little minutes reminding us of who we are. Minister of International Development and Minister of La Francophonie. It is not the government's business, really, to look after the economic development even of Canada, except by providing, the rule of law, preventing force and fraud, building infrastructure. We don't need that even domestically. We sure aren't meant to be doing it in other countries. And a Minister of La Francophonie? This is just preposterous. Oh, a Minister of Families, Children and Social Development. Oh yeah, people never had families till there was a government.
But also that's provincial jurisdiction, is it not?
Well, we're getting to provincial jurisdiction. Because we're going to knock some of these off.
My point is
twice.
There should not be a federal department of that since it's provincial jurisdiction.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. Again, that's not a provincial issue. That's just ludicrous that government thinks it can do that stuff. Can you name an organization that is more harmful to prosperity and less innovative than government? But now we do get to the provincial jurisdiction. I would get rid of the Minister of Health, because health, under our Constitution, is a provincial responsibility. If it weren't, I would argue that it should be. It is quite clear that things like this, if the government's to be involved in healthcare at all, and frankly, I don't believe that it should be. I believe that Canadians are compassionate and intelligent. And if there wasn't government healthcare, we would look after one another far better. And with proper insurance markets for most of us, healthcare would be far more affordable, far more dynamic, far more effective. But even if you think the government should do it, it needs to go to the provincial level, because if people closer to the populace are delivering it and they're capable of innovating and experimenting and seeing what works and then imitating one another, you would get much better government healthcare. I don't think it would work very well anyway, but it would work a lot better than it does. Instead, we deliver healthcare on the Soviet model, and we violate our Constitution in order to do it. So that is just a preposterous thing. I would get rid of the Ministry of Health. Let me see what else I can just chop here from my list. There's all sorts of ludicrous stuff. I mean, there are things that we do need. There are things that are legitimate government. Minister of Sport? What? There's a Minister of Sport?
It was usually not a very fit person, too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, politics may not be a very healthy life, but what's that? Minister of Small Business and Tourism. Huh? It's just, there's no rational theory under which any of this is the responsibility of government, and there is no way in which government involving itself in all this stuff is going to make our lives better or happier. There are some things you need. You need a Ministry of the Environment. That's a federal responsibility. You need a Minister of Immigration. I mean, you could put immigration into foreign affairs, but, government's big and unwieldy, so I can live with all of that. But there's so much stuff here the government just shouldn't be doing, and then there are the things that are also clearly constitutionally mandated to be provincial responsibilities. Now, how do you get rid of them? It's an important principle when you're doing things in government, especially if you are doing things that strike people as drastic, to make the losers into winners. For instance, if you're going to get rid of a restrictive taxi licensing regime and all the taxi drivers panic, partly because they've invested so much in these permits or medallions or whatever you call them, and they see them, their savings, they were going to sell this and retire when they were done with their career, look like they're going to be wiped out. Well, what you do is you buy them out at the current market value. You don't deprive them of all their value by changing the regulations and then compensate people for a pittance. If it's really better for society not to have these restrictive practices, those people who invested in good faith should not be harmed. So the same thing, when you're going to get rid of all these government departments, the first thing that you need to do is deal with the vested interest of public servants who think they have jobs for life and pensions for life. We've got to do something about the pension crisis, but a soft landing is important to maintain public trust. I mean, social trust. I'm talking about this very broad phenomenon that when people live their lives because they believe the rules are a certain way, whether it's a government job or anything else, you don't just yank the rug out from under them and go, oh, wow, sucks being you, huh? So you have to make provision for the people who are currently employed to wind up the affairs of the department in an orderly way and not to be simply cast out without prospects or warning or anything like that. You want to arrange a smooth and fair transition. But you want to do it bearing in mind that most of us are paying excessively high taxes, not having these comfortable pension plans, in order to support a government sector that is unaffordable and that is doing things it shouldn't be doing in ways that are unhelpful. So, in principle, this thing that's hard for government, again, the Liberals are having fits trying to figure out how not to ban marijuana. How did we get to the point where the government can't figure out how not to interfere in your life? What is so hard about getting rid of laws? So, obviously, you have to pass legislation. You've got to wrap things up in an orderly way. But if it shouldn't exist, what you try and do is make it stop doing what it's doing, make it not exist, and give a smooth transition to those people whose lives are suddenly dramatically affected by it. But it's not in principle hard for governments not to do things. At least it didn't used to be. And I'll tell you what, if I was Prime Minister, you'd discover it wasn't again.
All right. Well, thanks for that. Folks, if you would like to play along and ask your question of the professor, the URL on your screen will take you to a page where everything is explained. Thanks, and see you next time.